Hello and welcome back to the studio and to Gardentober. Unfortunately, the nature of these challenges is that things go wrong because I don't have a ton of time to work on them. And today I started the video without audio. So that was not the plan. That's why I have a lot of fun gestures going on. But I'm going to do a quick audio over kind of the color mixing and starting things off for us. And then the rest of the video, there will be audio that connects. Today we're going to be painting gardenias, and we're going to keep the palette very simple and very similar to the other paintings in this series. So we're starting with our ultramarine blue, which is a pretty standard blue. It's probably one that you have in your paint kit. I'm also going to be using Winsor yellow, which is similar to a lemon yellow hue or a transparent yellow if you've followed my tutorials in the past. And we're also going to use a Winsor red. Similar to that would be kind of like an alizarin crimson, or really even closer would be more like a cadmium red. That's pretty popular in a lot of beginner paint sets. So those are the paints that we're going to be using, and we're just going to use those three colors to mix all the colors that we need. Now, our gardenia doesn't have a ton of color on it. It is a white flower, so we'll be working with a lot of neutral tones and also mixing our own greenery and stuff like that. So we're just using blue and yellow to mix green, our Winsor yellow, and our ultramarine blue. I prefer to have a little bit of red in there just to kind of desaturate it, which we'll add in there in a little bit. I also like to have kind of a variety, kind of a gradient of a spectrum of a specific color. So you'll see that I will have a more blue tone green and then a more yellow tone green. Sometimes I really use that a lot, like in our last painting of the hibiscus that we did earlier in this challenge. And other times I don't really end up using it. And spoiler alert, I'm not really going to use it a ton this time. But you can see how I'm adding the red in there, and it helps to desaturate it and kind of calm everything down. In hindsight and looking at my painting with fresh eyes today, I wouldn't have used quite so much red. So feel free to make it a little bit brighter than what you see me doing here, just because as I'm looking at it now, it's definitely green, but it's a little bit gray, and it will definitely look kind of gray on the screen. The green doesn't come across quite as well, but that's okay. That's part of painting and part of experimenting, and just kind of growing and having fun with things. We're also going to mix kind of a warm goldeny yellow color. With my brush still dirty from the green, I grabbed some of the yellow and a little bit of that red in there, and we've got this nice warm glowing tone, which we'll use for the center of our gardenia. I also want to mix kind of a neutral tone. Again, in hindsight, would have kept this a little more saturated, a little bit more brown, but I definitely went with a very gray tone. So we're mixing, we've got our red down there already, we're adding some yellow to that. The brush is dirty, so it's already pretty saturated, but I'm going to add a little bit more blue in here, and by using those three primary colors, we're going to get a nice neutral tone. Now, depending on how you mix it will change the underlying tone of it. So here it's definitely very red and reddy, and it's more of like a warm brown tone, but you can see that the areas that have a little bit more blue in it, a little more cool tone, a little bit more of a gray. And basically I went back and forth until I found a tone kind of like this. It did end up being, see how I added that little bit of blue there? It ended up being a little bit more of a gray tone than I might have gone for kind of cognitively. I tend to prefer kind of warmer whites, but it worked really well. And you'll see how we kind of used that to create the shadows of our white flower. I explained this, but it's kind of too confusing to do a voiceover. But what I do a lot when I'm painting is you'll hear me say rinse, dab. This is what I do when I'm dabbing. I'm just dabbing, I'm literally just kind of gently touching this towel. And there's nothing fancy about this towel. It's an old bath towel that I literally cut into a bunch of pieces so I could always have one ready to paint with. And a rinse is usually just kind of either a quick, so like water, dab, and then like I'll go about my way. If I'm cleaning my brush off really well, that's when I'm like kind of scraping on the sides. I'm really trying to get that paint off. But in general, when I say like water or rinse, I'm usually just kind of like just barely sticking the brush in there. It's mostly either to dilute the paint a little bit, or to get more water on my brush so that I'm able to dilute the paint that's on the paper. So that's something that I work on. If I'm doing if I say like really clean, then I'm probably putting it in the dirty water and then, like rinsing it real well and then putting it in my clean water to then have a clean brush. A clean damp brush, I may have done that, I may have not. I usually work with dirty water. That's just kind of who I am. But anyway, let's go back All right, back to your favorite voiceover. I'm not going to be here for long, don't worry. We're just going to add the initial layer of paint. We're working in the darkest areas of the flower first in order to kind of get started. I like to get a gauge for what I'm doing. You can see here I'm using this large size 10 brush. Don't recommend that. Decide to switch to a smaller size 6 brush so I'm able to fit into some of these smaller areas. I'm just putting down a first pass. Now you can see that the water, the pigment that I have down, it's pretty watery at this point. And you're gonna see how the colors separate a little bit because of that ultramarine blue. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, but if you want to have some separation of your colors, lay it down with a little bit more water. I don't usually work that way, and so you'll see that I'll be dabbing my brush off a lot more and kind of getting rid of some of that water, that excess water on there, without leaving that behind. And here I'm just going petal to petal and I'm slowly building these shadows. Again, I'm starting with the very darkest areas and I'm slowly blending it out. I'm not using a lot of pigment or a lot of water on my brush, and I'm just kind of allowing these light layers to slowly build up. We'll be going petal by petal in just a moment, but I just wanted to show you, since we were I didn't get the audio of this, I wanted to talk through some of my thoughts a little bit before I leave you totally hanging. But see, we're just starting in the very deepest part of the shadow and slowly blending that on out. All right, so this is already starting to take shape and I actually love where it's going. Thank goodness, because honestly, I'm at the point, I'm in the mood to just give up. So I'm going to take my brush that is now quite clean. I'm going to grab some paint, dab it off, and I'm going to start placing it in this petal here. And if you look at my reference image, there'll be an arrow there pointing you to where we're going. I'm dipping it in the water, dabbing it off on my towel, and then we're just going to kind of blend that out. Dab, dip, and then dab. And then I'm just, so now I have mostly water on my brush. I'm just taking the pigment that's already here because I want it to be light. This is a white flower after all. I'm just carrying it over. Then I'm going to grab a little more pigment, just a little bit, and I'm going to focus it a touch more in some of these areas that are in deeper shadow, dabbing that off. So I've got a damp, dirty brush. Bring it down, grabbing a little more pigment, dabbing off any excess, and kind of bringing it around like that. And that's how you can kind of slowly build it up. So a little bit of paint at a time, dabbing that in there. This is as much as I'm grabbing. I'm not like stirring it up in there. These are very light layers. We want to keep our paint light. You can see how the colors are separating a bit in order to, so that's just when you're using ultramarine blue, it's very granular, which just basically means that it's going to separate. That's what it means here. In this situation, it's a little more complicated, but we can talk about that in another video. And so you just kind of do like a kind of a quick, like that. The granular color is also how we got kind of this blue separation, because the blue pooled here or was dropped and the rest of the pigment moved around with the water. I actually love the way that that's working out. If that's something that you don't like, maybe pick a different blue. Or you're going to just have to do more layers and have them be a little lighter, not as wet. Okay, rinsing, dabbing it off, and it's damp, but there's not extra pigment to carry around. And it's not so wet that it's going to disperse a bunch of water down and give us a bloom. A bloom is just kind of a aggressive spread of the water. We'll probably have one or two, and actually I think I just made one, but we can talk about that later. I'll have an example on the screen real quick for you. They're not a bad thing unless you're trying to not get one, which I kind of am, trying to not get one. Wiping my brush off. All All right, I think I'm gonna need to come back in here in a little bit just because it's staying a little too wet. But dabbing that in should help. Now I'm going to go into this section here, grabbing a little pigment, quick dab, so it's not too much pigment down at once. Rinse and dab. Just to carry this around, and we'll keep the highlights very white. So more and more of this flower will be white as we kind of go along. Let's see, we've got this section here. Actually goes back here. All right, and I'm going to go in here. And this will just be very light. Carving out the shape of this petal underneath it. All right, grabbing some more pigment, I'm going to deepen this section just a touch, wiping the brush off. You see how I'm pushing my brush down and then I'm dispersing less pigment. It's a great technique for blending. Tapping with your brush kind of pointing down on the paper disperses more product, but when you're kind of pushing down and pulling, that is going to disperse less and potentially even pick some up. So it's a great kind of trying to dance between those two will help you get kind of the look that you're going for. All right, now we're going to work on this petal. Rinse, dab, dab off, and then I'm pulling to get a better blend, dabbing that off, pushing and pulling to get that nice blend. It'll need to be a little deeper here. Kind of here. All right, and then we're just going to leave that as is. The hardest part with the white flowers is to not overwork it. It's so easy to just take what you see and exaggerate it and kind of run with it. And we're just going to come around the side here. A little more water. Kind of pushing and pull. Rinse, dab off. I'm going to add a little more here to give this a shadow. Just kind of lift this one up a bit. Rinse, dab it off. Too much water, so I'm going to dab that off and pick this up. So I added too much water, not a big deal, but I'm going to have to go back in that shadow that we added. I just kind of scooped it all up. So I'm going to let that dry, and we're going to go in with another pass and add that shadow back in. Just part of the wonders of watercolor. We're kind of doing the same thing, but in the placing down part here. So I'm going to rinse my brush off, dry it off, make sure that it's not too wet, and then blend that out. All right. And we're just gonna kind of keep moving right along. So we've got this one's in a little bit more shadow. Let's see if this is our pointed one, then this one goes here. Rinse, dab, and we're just gonna blend that out. Dabbing it off again, picking up that excess water that I keep putting on for some reason. All right, grabbing a little more pigment, dabbing it off. A little more pigment. I'm going to place that right in here where it's deepest before everything fully dries, and bringing it out in kind of a blended out way. Now before I get too far, it looks like this section's ready, so I'm going to kind of add that in. Just do the same steps that we've been doing. I'm going to keep the shadow right by the petal so it's clear that it's a cast shadow. Rinse, dab it off real well. And again, going for a little more pigment for on this side. Rinse, dab, dab again. Okay, not too bad. All right, next we have, so we've got this section. I'm gonna have this one that's pointed out a bit. Woo. Dabbing my brush off and pull this down. And just so it doesn't get all kind of kerfluffled, I'm gonna blend this out, rinse, dabbing my brush off. Okay, we're gonna let that be nice and light. I'm going in with a little bit more of our pigment, our nice shadowed pigment. And I'm going to start to work on, I've got kind of a highlighted area here. Fine-tuning some of these shadows. We're not going to do a ton because we already got pretty dark in here. We don't need to go a lot darker. But one more pass should help to kind of clarify some of these shadows a bit. Rinse, dab. Just by kind of gently stroking, I'm going to reactivate some of that pigment, dabbing my brush off so it's not too wet. Dabbing it off. I'm actually going to grab a little more water And we're gonna kind of fine tune this area. Now, none of these colors that we're using are staining, so I am able to pick up some of this pigment in order to rework it. At least they're not staining at this point. Some colors, once you put it down, it's down. I hope that you liked it. Which can be a little more challenging to work with and not something that I prefer to work with or necessarily recommend. Some of my favorite colors, like Perylene Green, is pretty staining, but there is some forgiveness with it. Like you have a little bit of time. But yeah, just something to kind of keep in mind. Let's see how this guy goes up here. All right, grabbing a little more pigment, we're going to fine tune this. We've got this petal that comes here. It comes down and it is quite dark down here. I'm going to pick up some more pigment and let it get darker in here, but with intentionality. So we're going to give a little clean but damp brush, and we're going to blend it out a bit. A little more pigment just to carve out that area. And then repeat the color here. Rinse, dab. Dab it off again. Just like erased it with that aggressive. Dabbing it off and blending that around. But see how this section now kind of glows? I don't want to be quite that intense, even though I want it to be lighter. There we go. So we just kind of did a quick whoop with a little bit of pigment on that brush in order to make sure that it's just not quite so aggressive. We're going to do the same thing here with this piece that kind of glows. It is, I mean, there is a highlight on there, so we don't want to like do away with that, but it's not that aggressive. So I'm going to take most of the pigment off of my brush and most of the water. I'm just going to kind of dab a little bit of pigment in there just so it's not quite so bright anymore. All right, more pigment, pretty dry brush. Dab it once or twice just to make sure you're not carrying around any excess. And we're just going to kind of carve out some of these petals just a little bit. Dabbing it off again. Rinse, dab. All right, we're definitely getting kind of fussy at this point. So I'm just going to do the one or two things that we know for sure we need. We need this a little bit deeper. Just kind of put that in. Some shadow. All right, so I'm going to work on this flower. We're just going to do kind of the same thing. Our light source is coming kind of from this direction, a little bit behind, so I'm just going to focus on that. I don't have a set reference image for it, but we're just going to kind of try and mimic what we have going on here. let's switch over. I'm actually going to switch back to my larger brush. You don't have to, I'm going to. And I'm going to paint some of this greenery in here. I'm going to grab some red. So this is kind of the color we've got now, where you can see there's a little more of a red in it. It's a little more desaturated, not quite as bright as this section. I'm going to add some water, and we're just going to go in kind of smaller sections. Carve out around some of these petals. And I'm just going to kind of go leaf by leaf at this point. We can dab a little extra in here where there's going to be more of a shadow and just let it bleed out. We'll just see what it does. I'll grab some more. I'm going to go with this section. I'm skipping this leaf because these two would be touching. And this is a very different style than what we did for the other one, for our hibiscus. It's a similar layout, but just a different painting style as far as tackling the leaves. It's just kind of good to experiment with different things, so well, that's what we're doing. All right, now I'm going to go in a little lighter for some of these other leaves, just to add some kind of natural depth in here. I'm still kind of dabbing in that extra pigment kind of at the base here, but just letting it be a little lighter. And before that totally dries, rinsing my brush real well, dabbing it off, rinsing it in my clean water, dabbing it off, and I'm just going to pull it along these edges, dab it off to kind of soften it. Dabbing it off, again, rinse, dab. All right, switching back to my smaller size 6 brush, making sure we're nice and clean. Going back into our neutral tone, I'm gonna bring these in because they're just looking a little stark. They're close, but they're not quite there yet. So I'm going to just add a little bit of our pigment in here. Most of this will be nice and light, but it's not completely. And then this one needs to be a little deeper. I'll just reactivate this. And if I couldn't reactivate this pigment, I would just make this a separate petal. And so you would treat it like there's a shadow down here and work from there. So sometimes you just totally miss and you forget something and you make a new composition. And sometimes you can fix it. Sometimes you can save it enough to kind of go back with your original plan. So we'll see if this works, and if it doesn't, we'll just add kind of a hard cast shadow in here to define the two petals, set the now two petals separate from each other, and go from there. So I'm going to carve this out, some differentiation. And then I'm going to pick up what's in here. Rinse, dab it off. All right, now I'm going to go in with our green. Guess we wasted our time mixing the lighter green because I'm just not feeling it. I'm going to add this stem in nice and dark. It's kind of debating between going lighter or darker, and I'm just feeling the dark. So we could go in here and add more definition with the foliage. I don't think I'm going to. I don't know if it's sheer laziness or what, but I think we're just gonna wrap this puppy up. It was not spectacularly done, but we made it work. And I'm going to do a little bit of a red glaze on some of these tips, just because. So this is totally optional. It's just something that adds a little bit of interest by having a little bit of an unexpected color here, just kind of at the tips. It just gives a little something extra that some people won't notice, but it will cause them to kind of pause and look a little longer. All right, now is when we pause, we take a look back, we assess, see if there's anything that we need to add or just kind of play around with. I do wish we could add the yellow in here somewhere else because it just feels very isolated here. So I might brush a little, kind of like a glaze, a little bit like a heavy glaze here on the sides. So even though I didn't like it glazed on the petals, it just doesn't seem finished without a little more somewhere on here. So I'm just going to add a little more. Just a little scattered around. And then kind of finally up here a bit. All right, maybe not the best idea, but I feel kind of better about it overall. Don't even know if you can see that. I can see it in person. But anyway, I hope that you found this tutorial interesting and helpful, that you enjoyed painting it with me, that you're enjoying Gardentober so far. If you'd like to see the other videos in the Gardentober playlist where we're just going through this different challenge playlist and creating drawings off of this prompt, I'll have them all linked down for you in the description. And until next time, happy painting.